My name is Grace Miller, and my family erased me from my own brother's wedding. Not by accident, not because of distance, not because I couldn't make it, but because they chose to pretend I didn't exist. And I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of the story, because if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever sat at a table where everyone talks around you instead of to you, then you'll know exactly how this feels, because what happened to me didn't start on the day of the wedding. It started years before, in small moments that didn't seem important at the time, the jokes that went a little too far, the comparisons that never stopped the way my brother Noah Miller was always the center of attention, while I quietly carried responsibilities no one ever thanked me for. And I told myself it was normal that every family had favorites, that love just looked different for different people. But deep down, there was always this quiet question I never dared to ask out loud. What if I was never really part of this family the way I thought I was? And I ignored that feeling for years because it was easier to believe in a version of my family that loved me than to face the possibility that they only tolerated me, that I was only included when it was convenient, useful, or expected. And then one simple phone call changed everything. My father's voice, cheerful, almost rehearsed, telling me about a wedding that was supposedly coming up, asking me to be there, making it sound like I mattered, like I was wanted. And for a moment I believed him. I really did. I felt that familiar pull in my chest, that hope that maybe things were finally changing, that maybe this was the moment our family would come back together, that maybe I had been wrong all along. So I said yes. Without hesitation, I smiled. Even though he couldn't see me, I started thinking about what I would wear, what gift I would bring, how I would stand there and celebrate my brother, even after everything. Because that's what I had always done. I showed up. I stayed quiet. I loved harder than I was loved in return. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that while I was holding on to hope, they were already moving forward, without me. Already planning a day that would prove once and for all where I stood in their lives. And when the truth finally came, it didn't arrive gently. It didn't come with apologies or explanations. It came in a single sentence that shattered everything I thought I knew. And in that moment, I realized something that would change me forever. I wasn't forgotten. I was erased. Deliberately, carefully, completely. And if you think this is just another family misunderstanding, stay with me, because what happened next will make you question everything you believe about loyalty, love, and the people you trust the most. And if this story resonates with you in any way, you can follow along quietly, because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we recognize in our own lives. I wasn't late. I wasn't busy. And I wasn't stuck somewhere I couldn't escape from. I was simply never invited. And that is a very different kind of pain. The kind that doesn't hit you all at once, but settles slowly into your chest, heavy and undeniable. Because being late means you tried. Being busy means you had a reason. But being excluded means someone made a decision about you. And in my case, that decision was made by the people who were supposed to love me the most. And the worst part is how normal it all felt at first. Because when my father called me and mentioned the wedding, nothing sounded wrong. Nothing felt suspicious enough to question, and I didn't stop to ask why I hadn't heard about it earlier. I didn't ask why there were no messages, no invitations, no details. I just accepted it because somewhere deep inside me, I had been trained not to question things when it came to my family. I had learned to take whatever version of reality they handed me and make it make sense even when it didn't. And that's how I ended up standing outside my own life, believing I was still part of it while they quietly moved forward without me. And if you've ever trusted someone so completely that you didn't even think to doubt them, then you'll understand how easy it is to miss the signs. The silence that should have felt strange, the absence of small details that should have mattered, the way no one checked in, no one followed up, no one made sure I was actually coming, and yet I still believed I was included because I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it because the alternative was too painful to face, the idea that I wasn't just overlooked, but intentionally left out, that I wasn't part of the plan at all. And when I look back now, I can see it clearly, the way everything was carefully arranged. So I would stay just close enough to not question it, but far enough to never actually be there. And that realization changes something inside you. It forces you to see every past moment in a different light, every time you felt like an afterthought, every time your presence seemed optional, every time you told yourself you were overthinking, when deep down, you already knew the truth. And if this sounds familiar, if any part of this reminds you of your own experience, take a second to breathe and recognize that feeling, because it matters. And if you're still here, listening to this story, quietly following along, you already understand more than you think. So if this moment resonates with you, you can leave a like or subscribe, not because you have to, but because stories like this deserve to be heard, especially by people who have felt the same silence, the same absence, the same invisible line between being present and truly being wanted. My brother Noah Miller got married, and I found out after it was already over, and I wish I could tell you that I handled that moment with calm understanding, that I paused, asked questions, and gave my family the benefit of the doubt. But the truth is much simpler and much more painful than that, because when my mother said those words, the wedding already happened, something inside me didn't just crack, it collapsed completely, like a structure I had spent years building, suddenly giving way all at once. And for a few seconds, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood her, that maybe I heard it wrong, that maybe she meant something else, but she didn't. Her voice was steady, almost casual, as if she were telling me about a normal day. And that calmness made it worse, because it meant this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't chaos or confusion. It was planned, controlled, intentional. And in that moment, the world around me felt distant, like I was sitting inside my own life, watching it unfold, without me trying to process how something so important could happen, without anyone thinking to include me. And the questions came, all at once. Why didn't Noah call me? Why didn't anyone double check? Why did they let me believe I was going to be there? Why did they let me buy a gift? Why did they let me feel excited about something I was never meant to be part of? And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about forgetting. People don't forget their own daughter, their own sister. Not for something like this they choose. And that realization cuts deeper than anything else, because being forgotten can be forgiven. But being excluded requires intention. And intention means they had time to think about it, to consider it, to decide that my presence wasn't necessary, or worse, wasn't wanted. And I remember sitting there in silence after the call ended, staring at nothing, replaying every word, every tone, every pause, trying to find some hidden meaning that would make it less painful. But there wasn't one. The truth was exactly what it sounded like. They had a wedding. They celebrated. They smiled. They took photos. They created memories. And they did all of it without me. And what hurts the most isn't just missing the event. It's missing the moment, the connection, the feeling of being part of something that matters. Because weddings aren't just ceremonies. They're statements. They show who belongs, who stands beside you, who you choose to include in one of the most important days of your life. And in that moment, Noah made his choice. My family made their choice. And I wasn't in it. And if you've ever experienced something like this, if you've ever been left out of something that should have included you without question, then you already know how heavy that realization feels. So I want to ask you something honestly. Do you think this was just a misunderstanding? Or was it a deliberate decision? Because if you believe it was intentional, comment number 2 below. I want to know how you see it. Because sometimes hearing other perspectives is the only way we make sense of moments that feel impossible to understand. Days before the wedding, my father called me with a smile in his voice, the kind of tone that feels warm on the surface, but leaves something uneasy underneath. And if I'm honest, I should have noticed it then, that slight hesitation, that almost rehearsed tearfulness, like he was following a script, instead of speaking naturally. But I didn't question it, because I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that for once something in my family was simple and genuine. And when he said, Make sure you're free. Next Saturday, your brother's wedding is coming up. It sounded so normal, so casual, like this was information I had already known, and we were just confirming it. And that's exactly why it worked, because there was no urgency, no explanation, no acknowledgement that I had somehow missed months of planning, just a smooth continuation of a story I hadn't been part of. And I remember leaning against my car, holding my phone, trying to match his words with my reality, because nothing lined up. There had been no earlier conversations, no group messages, no hints dropped during family dinners, no excitement shared, nothing. And yet he spoke as if I had always been included, as if I was just late to the details, not completely absent from the entire process. And instead of asking questions, instead of stopping him and saying, "Why am I only hearing about this?" Now I stayed quiet, I played along, I filled in the gaps myself, because that's what I had been doing my whole life, making their version of things make sense, even when it didn't. And he kept talking casually, mentioning how my mother had been planning everything for months, how the venue was already booked, how the decorations were set, how everything was coming together perfectly, and every word should have been a red flag. Every detail should have made me pause, because how could something this big be happening for months without me knowing? But instead of questioning it, I felt something else: relief. Because for a brief moment, it felt like I was still part of the family, like I hadn't been forgotten, like whatever distance had been growing between us wasn't permanent. And that feeling was so strong that it drowned out everything else, every doubt, every inconsistency, every quiet warning in the back of my mind. And that's the part that hurts the most when I think back on it. Now, not just that he lied, but that he made the lie believable enough for me to trust it, for me to accept it without resistance, for me to build hope on top of it. Because hope is a powerful thing. It makes you ignore what doesn't make sense. It makes you accept what you should question. It makes you stay in situations that don't deserve you. And I didn't know it at the time. But that phone call wasn't just information. It was preparation. It was a carefully constructed moment designed to keep me calm, to keep me from asking questions, to keep me exactly where they needed me to be, unaware, uninvited, and completely outside of what was really happening. And if you've ever had a moment like that where everything seemed normal until you looked back and realized how carefully it had been controlled then, you know how unsettling it feels, because the truth isn't just that you were lied to, it's that the lie was built in a way that made you participate in it without even realizing. And that realization changes the way you hear every word after that. So I believed him completely, without hesitation. And that might sound naive from the outside, but when you've spent your whole life trying to hold on to a connection that keeps slipping away, you don't question the moments that like they might bring it back. You hold on to them. You protect them, you build hope around them, and that's exactly what I did. The second I hung up that call, I stood there for a moment, replaying his words in my head, letting them settle, letting them feel real, because for the first time in a long time, I felt included, like I had been brought back into something I thought I was slowly losing. And instead of asking why I hadn't been told sooner, instead of noticing how little sense it all made, focused on what I could control, showing up, supporting my brother, being present in a moment that mattered. Because that's who I had always been in this family. The one who adjusted, the one who filled in the gaps, the one who showed up even when no one asked her to. And within minutes, I was already searching online for a wedding gift, scrolling through pages of options, comparing prices, thinking about what would be meaningful, what would show that, despite everything I cared, that I was still part of this. And I remember pausing on one item, something I had heard Noah mention once, in passing, something small, but specific enough to feel personal, and that detail mattered to me more than anything else, because it meant I was paying attention, even if no one else was. And as I added it to my cart, I didn't think about the cost. I didn't think about whether it was too much. I just clicked purchase, because in that moment it wasn't about money. It was about belonging, about proving to myself that I still had a place in this family, that I still mattered. And after that, I started planning everything else. What I would wear, how I would travel, what I would say when I saw him, even imagining the small conversations we might have, the smiles, the photos, the feeling of standing there as his sister. And looking back now, I realize how much of that was built on something that wasn't real, but at the time it felt completely genuine, completely possible. And that's the part that makes what came after so much harder to process. Because I didn't just accept the lie. I built something on top of it. I invested time, energy, emotion into a moment that was never meant to include me. And if you've ever done that, if you've ever poured yourself into something only to find out later it was never truly yours, then you know how disorienting that realization can be, because it forces you to question not just what happened, but everything you felt along the way, every bit of excitement, every moment of anticipation, every decision you made, believing you were part of something real. And if you're still listening to this, still following this story step by step, then you already understand how quickly hope can turn into something else entirely. So if you want to see how everything unfolded after this moment, you can stay with me and follow along, because sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once. It shows up, piece by piece. And what came next was something I never saw coming. But when I asked for the details, everything changed in a way I wasn't prepared for, because up until that moment, no matter how strange things felt, I could still hold on to the version of reality. My father had given me the version where I was included, where I just needed to catch up, where everything would make sense once I had the full picture. So I made that call, expecting clarity, expecting simple answers, like the venue, the time, what color I should wear, normal questions for a normal situation. And I remember trying to sound casual, trying not to reveal the quiet confusion that had been building inside me, because I didn't want to seem like I was overthinking. I didn't want to risk turning something good into something awkward. And that's the habit you develop when you've spent years adjusting yourself to keep peace. You minimize your doubts. You soften your questions. You make everything smaller, so no one else feels uncomfortable. And for a few seconds, the conversation felt ordinary. My mother picked up her voice, calm, almost distant, and I started asking about the wedding lightly. At first, waiting for her to fill in the gaps, waiting for her to confirm what my father had said, but instead of details, there was a pause, a silence, that stretched just a little too long. And in that silence, something shifted, something subtle but undeniable. And then she said it, not with hesitation, not with concern, but with a kind of simplicity that made it feel even heavier. The wedding already happened. And I don't think there's a way to fully describe what that moment feels like unless you've lived it, because it's not just shock, it's not just confusion, it's a complete collapse. Real, just seconds before, and suddenly all the pieces that didn't make sense start locking into place. The lack of details, the absence of conversation, the strange timing. It all becomes clear at once. And you realize you weren't waiting for information. You were waiting for a truth that no one intended to give you. And I remember gripping my phone tighter without even realizing it, like somehow holding on physically could keep everything from slipping away mentally. And my first instinct wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was disbelief. Because part of me still wanted to find an explanation that made this okay. Something that would justify it, something that would turn it back into a misunderstanding instead of what it really was. But there was no correction, no follow-up, no attempt to soften the impact, just silence on the other end, as if what she said required no further explanation. And that silence said more than anything else, because it meant this wasn't new information to them. It wasn't something shocking or difficult. It was simply a fact they had already accepted, and I was the only one hearing it for the first time. And if you've ever had a moment like that, where one sentence changes everything, where the ground beneath you feels steady 1 second and completely gone the next, then you know how hard it is to process what comes after, because your mind keeps trying to go back to what it believed just moments before. And if you're still here, still listening as this unfolds piece by piece, you can stay with me and follow along. Because what I learned after that moment didn't just explain what happened, it changed how I saw everything that came before it. The wedding already happened yesterday, she said, and it's strange how a single sentence can split your reality into two completely different versions. One where everything still makes sense, and one where nothing ever will again. And I remember sitting there in silence, holding on to that one word, yesterday, repeating it in my mind. Like if I said it enough times, it would start to feel less real, less final, less like something I had permanently missed. Because yesterday means there's no going back, no fixing it, no showing up late with an apology and a smile. It means the moment is gone, sealed off, turned into a memory that everyone else shares except you. And what makes it worse is how casually it was delivered. No pause, no softness, no attempt to prepare me for what I was about to hear. Just a flat statement dropped into the conversation like it carried no weight at all. And that's the part that stayed with me longer than anything else. Not just what she said, but how she said it. Because it told me everything I needed to know, without her having to explain a single thing. It told me this wasn't shocking to her. It wasn't something she struggled to say. It was just information, simple and complete. And I was the only one reacting like it meant something. And I remember trying to respond, trying to form a sentence that made sense in a moment. That didn't. But nothing came out right. Because how do you respond to something like that? Do you ask? Why do you ask? How do you pretend it's okay? Or do you just sit there and let the silence speak for you? And in that moment, I chose silence, not because I didn't have questions, but because I suddenly realized I might not want the answers, because answers would make it real, in a way I couldn't undo. And there's a strange kind of protection in not knowing everything, in staying just uncertain enough to believe there could still be an explanation that doesn't hurt as much. But deep down, I already knew. I knew this wasn't a mistake. I knew this wasn't something that just happened. I knew there had been time planning decisions made without me, and the realization didn't come as one sharp moment. It spread slowly, like a crack moving through glass, quiet but unstoppable, until everything I thought I understood about my place in that family started to fall apart. And if you've ever had a moment where the truth didn't arrive as a shock, but as a slow confirmation of something you had always felt but never fully accepted, then you know how heavy that feeling can be, because it doesn't just hurt, it lingers. It reshapes the way you see every interaction, every memory, every moment where you thought you belonged. And now I want to ask you something honestly, because moments like this don't have one clear interpretation. Do you think her tone mattered more than her words? Or was the message itself already enough? Because sometimes how something is said reveals more than what is said. And if you have an opinion on that, I'd really like to hear it. So leave in your thoughts in the comments, because understanding different perspectives can sometimes make moments like this a little easier to carry. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, irreversible way that I didn't fully understand until much later. Because from the outside, nothing had changed. I was still sitting in the same place, holding the same phone, hearing the same silence on the other end. But internally, everything shifted like a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. And what made it even more unsettling was how calm I suddenly felt. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the hurt was too deep to process all at once. It didn't come as tears or anger, it came as stillness, like my mind was trying to protect me by slowing everything down. And in that stillness, a realization started to form. Not fully clear, yet but strong enough to be felt. They didn't forget me. They didn't accidentally leave me out. This wasn't a scheduling mistake or a communication error. This was a decision, and decisions like that don't happen without thought, without intention, without someone somewhere saying my name and choosing to move forward without it. And that thought stayed with me, repeating quietly in the background of everything else. They chose this. They chose a version of that day where I didn't exist. And the more I sat with it, the harder it became to ignore all the moments leading up to this, all the small signs I had brushed aside, all the times I told myself I was overthinking, all the subtle ways I had been kept at a distance without ever being directly pushed away. Because this wasn't just about one event, it was about a pattern, a slow, consistent positioning of me just outside of where I thought I belonged. And suddenly, everything started to look different. Every memory, every conversation, every time, I felt slightly out of place, but convinced myself it was nothing. It all connected in a way I hadn't allowed myself to see before. And that's the difficult part about realizations like this. They don't just explain the present, they rewrite the past. They force you to re-examine things you had already accepted, to question moments you thought were harmless to see, meaning where you once saw coincidence. And I remember sitting there, breathing slowly, trying to hold onto something stable, while everything inside me was quietly rearranging itself. Because once you see something like this clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing it was all unintentional. You can't convince yourself it didn't matter. And that's when the weight of it really starts to settle in. Not all at once, but gradually, like something pressing down, heavier with each passing second. And it's not just the pain of being excluded, it's the realization of what that exclusion represents, the message behind the action, the unspoken truth that says more than any words ever could. And if you've ever had a moment like that, where something inside you shifts so quietly that no one else notices but you feel completely different afterward, then you know how lasting that kind of break can be, because it doesn't show on the surface, but it changes everything underneath. But it didn't stop there, and that's the part I wasn't ready for, because a small part of me still hoped that maybe this was the worst of it, that maybe once the shock settled, things would slowly return to something familiar, something manageable. But that hope didn't last long, because a few weeks later, my phone rang again, and when I saw my mother's name on the screen, I hesitated for a second. Not out of anger, not even out of fear, but because something inside me had already started to shift that quiet break from before, still lingering in the background, making me more aware, more cautious, even if I couldn't fully explain why. And when I answered, her voice sounded different this time, softer, almost careful, like she was approaching something delicate, and that alone should have been enough to make me pause. Because in my family, softness was rarely about care. It was usually about timing, about choosing the right moment to ask for something. And sure enough, after a few minutes of small talk that felt strangely out of place, she brought it up, not directly at first, but gradually building toward it in a way that felt rehearsed, controlled, like she had gone over this conversation in her head before calling. And then finally she said it. They wanted to use my lake house, not for a visit, not for a short stay, but for my brother Noah and his wife to move in. As if it was the most natural request in the world. As if everything that had happened before had no weight at all. And I remember sitting there listening, feeling that same stillness return. But this time it wasn't shock. It was clarity, because suddenly, everything started to connect. In a way it hadn't. Before the wedding, the exclusion, the silence. And now this request, it wasn't random. It wasn't separate events. It was a pattern, a sequence, a progression that led directly to this moment. And for the first time, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel like I was missing something. I understood exactly what was happening. And that understanding didn't come with anger. It came with something quieter, something heavier. The realization that I wasn't being seen as a person in this situation. I was being seen as a resource, something to be used when needed. Something to be approached only when there was something to gain. And that realization changes the way you hear every word that follows. Every explanation, every justification, every attempt to make it sound reasonable. Because once you see the intention behind something, you can't unsee it. And I listened as she explained why it would help them, why it made sense, why it would be temporary. But none of those words carried the meaning they were supposed to, because the context had already stripped them of it. And what stayed with me wasn't what she was asking, but what she wasn't acknowledging. There was no mention of what had happened before, no recognition of how it might feel, no effort to bridge the gap that had been created, just a request moving forward, as if nothing had been broken. That's when I realized this wasn't about fixing anything, it was about continuing as if nothing needed to be fixed at all. Not to apologize, not to explain, not to even acknowledge what had happened, but to ask for my lake house. And that realization hit me harder than anything else before it. Because up until that moment, no matter how painful things had been, there was still a part of me holding on to the idea that maybe they would come back, maybe they would recognize what they had done, maybe there would be a conversation that made things feel human again. But this wasn't that moment. This was something entirely different. This was a request that moved forward as if nothing behind us mattered, as if the absence, the silence, the exclusion, all of it had no weight at all. And I remember the exact feeling that settled in my chest, not sharp, not explosive, but heavy and steady, like something finally falling into place. Because this wasn't just about the house, it was about what the request represented. The assumption that I would say yes, the expectation that I would adjust, that I would continue playing the same role. I had always played the one who makes things easier for everyone else, without asking for anything in return. And I could hear it in the way she spoke, the careful wording, the soft tone, the way she framed it as something reasonable, something temporary, something that would help the family. But none of those words changed what it really was, because underneath all of it was the same message I had been ignoring for years, that my value was tied to what I could provide, not who I was. And that's a difficult truth to face, because it forces you to look at every past moment through a different lens every time you said yes, when you wanted to say no every time. You gave more than you had every time you convinced yourself it was love when it was actually expectation. And in that moment, I realized that this request wasn't just about the present, it was about the pattern continuing, about them reaching out not to reconnect, but to access something they needed. And the clarity of that realization didn't come with anger the way you might expect. It came with something quieter, something more final, a kind of emotional distance that I hadn't felt before, like I was stepping back and seeing the situation from the outside for the first time. And once you reach that point, once you see things clearly without the need to justify or excuse them, everything changes. The way you listen, the way you respond, the way you decide what you're willing to accept. And I sat there holding the phone, hearing her continue to explain why it would be helpful, why it made sense, why it was the right thing to do. For the first time, those words didn't pull me in. They didn't make me feel responsible. They didn't make me question myself. They just existed separate from me. And if you've ever reached that moment where something that used to affect you deeply suddenly loses its power, then you know how significant that shift can be, because it means you're no longer reacting from habit. You're starting to see things for what they really are. And if this moment resonates with you, if you've ever felt that shift in your own life, you can leave a like or follow along quietly, because sometimes the biggest changes don't come from what people say, but from what you finally understand. Not to apologize, not to explain, not even to acknowledge what had already happened, but to ask for my lake house. And I think that was the exact moment. Everything inside me shifted from confusion to clarity, because until then, no matter how much it hurt, there was still a part of me trying to make sense of it, trying to find a version of the story where I wasn't deliberately pushed aside, where maybe something had gone wrong, maybe something had been misunderstood, but this request didn't leave any room for that kind of thinking. It moved forward, as if nothing behind us mattered, as if the wedding, the silence, the exclusion, all of it was irrelevant. And I remember noticing how carefully she chose her words, how she softened her tone, how she framed it as something small, temporary, reasonable. But underneath all of that, the message was clear. They weren't reaching out to reconnect. They were reaching out because they needed something, and that difference matters more than people realize, because when someone contacts you to fix a relationship, there's acknowledgement, there's hesitation, there's some awareness of what's broken. But when someone reaches out only when they need something, there's none of that. Just a smooth transition into the request, as if the past doesn't require any attention at all. And that's exactly what this felt like. A continuation, not a repair. And I could feel that realization settling in, not as anger, not as immediate rejection, but as something heavier and more permanent. A quiet understanding that this wasn't a one-time situation. It was a pattern that had probably been there longer than I wanted to admit. And suddenly I started seeing it everywhere. the way I was included only when it was convenient, the way my presence seemed optional, unless there was something to gain the way. Conversations would shift, depending on what was needed from me. And once you notice that pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore because it explains too much. It connects too many moments that once felt separate. And I sat there listening, hearing her explain why it would help Noah, why it would be easier for them, why it was just for a while. But none of those reasons answered the one question that mattered: why? Now? Why? After everything? Why? Approach me. Like nothing had happened. And the absence of that answer said more than anything she could have said, because it showed me that from their perspective, there was nothing to address, nothing to fix, nothing to even mention. And that's a realization that changes the way you respond. Because once you understand that someone doesn't see a problem, you also understand that they're not looking for a solution, they're just looking for access. And I want to ask you something, because situations like this don't always look the same from the outside. If you were in my place, hearing that request, after everything that happened, would you focus on what they're asking for or on what they're ignoring? Because sometimes what people leave unsaid tells you more than anything they actually say. And I'm really curious how you see it, so share your thoughts in the comments, because different perspectives can reveal things we might not notice on our own. They wanted my brother and his wife to stay there in my lake house, like nothing had happened, like there wasn't an entire history sitting between us that had never been acknowledged. And I think what made that moment so difficult wasn't just the request itself, but the way it was presented. So calm, so casual, as if it were the most natural continuation of events, as if the past had already been erased, without anyone having to talk about it. And I remember listening carefully, almost studying every word, every pause, every shift in tone, trying to understand how someone could move forward so easily after something that felt so significant to me, and that contrast between how much it meant to me and how little it seemed to mean to them was where the real weight of the situation settled, because it forced me to see that we weren't just experiencing the same event differently. We were living in completely different versions of reality in theirs. Nothing important had been broken. Nothing required attention. Nothing needed to be repaired. But in mine, something fundamental had shifted, something that couldn't simply be ignored or stepped over. And that difference changes everything. Because when two people don't agree on whether something matters, they can't agree on how to move forward from it. And I could hear it in the way she kept talking, explaining how it would help Noah, how it would give them stability, how it would only be temporary, how it would mean a lot to the family. And each of those points was presented as if it should naturally lead to a yes, as if the answer was already understood. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't a question. In the way I had thought, it was an expectation, something they believed would happen, because it always had before, because I had always been the one to adjust to compromise, to step in where needed, without asking too many questions. And that realization brought a kind of clarity that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time. Because once you see that expectation, clearly you also see the role you've been playing in maintaining it. And I started to wonder, not just about this moment, but about all the times before it all. The moments where I had said yes, without fully thinking about what it cost me. All the times I had accepted situations that didn't feel right, because it seemed easier than pushing back. And that reflection made this moment feel bigger than just a single decision. It felt like a turning point, a moment where I could either continue the pattern or finally step outside of it. And I think that's why it felt so heavy, not because I didn't know what they wanted, but because I was starting to understand what I wanted. And those two things weren't the same. And I want to ask you something, because moments like this are rarely simple. If you were in this situation, would you focus on keeping the peace or on breaking a pattern that no longer feels right? Because sometimes the hardest decisions aren't about what others expect from you, but about what you expect from yourself. And I'd really like to hear how you see it. So share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective might help someone else who's standing at the same kind of crossroads. When I said no, everything changed in a way that felt immediate and undeniable. Because up until that point, no matter how uncomfortable things had become, there was still a version of me that tried to keep the peace, that tried to soften the edges of every situation, that tried to respond in a way that would avoid conflict. But this time, the word came out differently, not loud, not aggressive, just steady, clear, and final. And I think that's what made it so powerful, because it wasn't just a refusal of the request, it was a refusal of the role I had been playing for years. And the silence that followed on the other end of the call felt heavier than anything that had been said before, like the entire dynamic had paused for a moment, recalibrating, adjusting to something it wasn't expecting. And then the shift happened, subtle at first, but impossible to miss. Once it started, the tone changed, the softness disappeared, the careful wording was replaced with something sharper, more direct. And that's when I realized how conditional everything had been, how quickly understanding could turn into frustration when the expected answer wasn't given. And I listened as the conversation moved in a direction I had seen before, but never fully recognized. The questioning began. Why not? What's the problem? Can't you just help this? Once each sentence carrying an assumption that my answer needed to be justified, explained, reconsidered, and that pressure wasn't new, it was familiar. It was something I had responded to so many times before, by adjusting, by giving in, by finding a way to make things work, even when it cost me something. But this time felt different, because the clarity I had found earlier didn't disappear. Under that pressure, it stayed steady and present, reminding me of everything that had led up to this moment. And that made it harder to go back to the version of myself that would have said yes just to avoid discomfort. And I think that's when the real conflict started, not just between me and them, but within myself, because saying no is one thing, standing by it is another, especially when you're used to being the person who smooths things over, who keeps things stable, who absorbs tension so no one else has to feel it. And I could feel that old instinct pulling at me, telling me it would be easier to just agree, to just let it go, to just return to what was familiar. But at the same time, there was something stronger pushing in the opposite direction, something that had been building quietly for a long time, and now finally had a voice. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a house. It wasn't just about a single decision. It was about whether I was willing to keep ignoring what I had already seen so clearly. And once you reach that point, once you truly understand something, it becomes much harder to act like you don't. And that's what made this moment feel so significant, because it wasn't just a reaction, it was a choice. And that choice had the potential to change everything that came after it. They blamed me, they pressured me. And when that still wasn't enough, they crossed a line I never thought they would even approach. And that's when everything stopped feeling like a family conflict and started feeling like something much colder, much more calculated. Because it's one thing to disagree, it's another to try to control the outcome. And I remember the moment it shifted, not with shouting, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, a message that arrived quietly, almost formally, filled with words that didn't sound like them at all. Words about responsibility, about rights, about consequences. And for a second, I actually questioned myself. I wondered if I had missed something, if there was something I didn't understand, because that's what pressure does when it's applied in a certain way. It makes you doubt your own position. It makes you step back and reconsider even the things you were sure about. But the longer I looked at it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about fairness. This wasn't about misunderstanding. This was about creating enough discomfort, enough uncertainty, enough fear to make me change my answer. And that realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, as I started to recognize the pattern behind it, the way the piece tone had shifted from soft to firm, from firm to demanding, and now from demanding to something that tried to carry authority it didn't actually have. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just pressure. It was escalation, a deliberate move to push me into a corner where saying no would feel harder than giving in. And I think what made it so difficult wasn't just the action itself, but what it revealed. Because when someone is willing to go that far, it tells you something about how they see you, not as someone to understand, not as someone to respect, but as someone to convince, to override, to move into position by any means necessary. And that's a hard thing to accept, because it strips away any illusion that this is just about misunderstanding or poor communication. It shows intention, and intention changes everything, because once you see that someone is not just reacting, but actively trying to shape your response, you can't go back to seeing their actions as accidental. And I remember sitting there reading the message again, feeling that same quiet stillness return. But this time it wasn't confusion. It wasn't even hurt in the way it had been before. It was something clearer, something sharper, a recognition that this situation had reached a point where it couldn't be handled the same way anymore. And I started to ask myself a different kind of question, not what they wanted, not what would make things easier, but what I was willing to accept moving forward. Because there's a point in situations like this where the focus shifts, where it's no longer about solving the immediate problem, but about deciding what kind of behavior you allow to continue in your life. And that's not an easy question to answer, especially when it involves people you've always considered close, but it's a necessary one, because ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just allows the pattern to repeat. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about standing my ground. Once it was about whether I was willing to stand it again, the next time, and the time after that. And that's when I understood that the decision in front of me was much bigger than it first appeared. That's when I finally understood the truth. And it didn't arrive as a sudden revelation or a dramatic realization. It came quietly, almost calmly, like something that had been waiting in the background for a long time, just for me to be ready to see it clearly. And once it settled in, it changed everything, not in a loud or visible way, but in how I interpreted every moment that had led me here. Because the truth wasn't just about what they had done recently. It reached further back, into years of small interactions, subtle patterns, things I had dismissed or explained away, because I didn't want to believe they meant anything deeper. And now, looking at it all from this new perspective, it felt impossible to ignore. What had always been there, I was never truly seen the way I thought. I was never valued simply for being part of the family. I was valued for what I could offer, for how I could contribute, for how I could make things easier, smoother, more convenient. And that distinction is something you don't always notice right away, because it often hides behind gestures that look like care, behind conversations that feel normal, behind expectations that seem reasonable until you step back and look at them as a whole. And that's exactly what I was doing in that moment, stepping back, not physically but emotionally, creating a distance that allowed me to see the full picture without immediately reacting to it. And what I saw wasn't something new, it was something consistent, something that had repeated in different forms over time. And the hardest part wasn't recognizing it, it was accepting it. Because once you accept something like that, you can't return to the version of reality you had before. You can't go back to interpreting things in the same way. You can't convince yourself that it's all harmless or unintentional. And that kind of acceptance comes with a weight that's difficult to describe. It's not just sadness, it's not just disappointment, it's something more complex, a mix of clarity and loss at the same time. Clarity because you finally understand what's really been happening, and loss because that understanding changes how you feel about people you once trusted without question. And I remember sitting there letting that realization settle, not rushing to respond, not trying to fix anything, just allowing myself to fully process it for the first time, without interrupting it with excuses or justifications. Because for so long, that's what I had done. I had filled in the gaps with explanations that made things easier to accept, but now there were no gaps left to fill. Everything was already clear, and that clarity brought with it a different kind of question. Not about them, not about their actions or their intentions, but about me, about what I was willing to continue being part of, about whether I wanted to stay in a dynamic where my value was conditional, where my presence depended on what I could provide. And those are not easy questions to answer, because they don't just affect one moment, they affect everything that comes after. And I think that's why this realization felt significant, because it wasn't just about understanding the past, it was about redefining the future. And once you reach that point, once you truly see the difference between being appreciated and being useful, it becomes very difficult to pretend they are the same thing. So I walked away, and I know that sounds simple when you say it out loud, like it was just a single decision made in a clear moment. But the truth is, walking away isn't something that happens all at once. It happens in layers and quiet shifts in small choices that slowly move you further from what you used to accept and closer to something you're still trying to understand. And I remember that first step not being dramatic or even visible to anyone else. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't an announcement. It was just a decision I made within myself. A line I chose not to cross again. And for the first time, that decision wasn't about protecting anyone else's comfort. It was about protecting my own sense of self, something I hadn't realized I had been slowly giving away over time. And that realization alone felt heavier than anything I had experienced before, because it forced me to see how much of myself I had adjusted, how much I had reshaped my reactions, my expectations, even my understanding of what was normal, just to fit into a dynamic that was never really balanced to begin with. And walking away didn't immediately fix everything. It didn't suddenly make things easy or peaceful. If anything, it brought a different kind of discomfort, the kind that comes with breaking patterns, with stepping outside of roles that once defined you. Because when you stop playing a role that others are used to, they don't always understand it. They question it. They push against it. Sometimes they even try to pull you back into it. And that's where the real challenge begins. Not in making the decision, but in holding on to it. Especially when it would be easier to go back, easier to explain things away, easier to return to what feels familiar, even if it doesn't feel right. And there were moments like that, moments where I questioned myself, where I wondered if I was being too rigid, too distant, too unwilling to compromise. But every time that doubt appeared, I came back to the same realization, the same clarity that had changed everything for me, that staying would mean continuing, something I no longer believed in, and leaving even with all its uncertainty meant giving myself the chance to build something different, something healthier, something that didn't require me to constantly prove my worth through what I could provide. And that's when I understood that walking away wasn't about losing something. It was about choosing something, choosing a version of my life where I had a voice, where my boundaries meant something, where my presence wasn't conditional. And that choice doesn't always feel empowering in the moment. Sometimes it feels lonely, sometimes it feels uncertain, but over time it starts to feel like stability, like something solid you can stand on, without questioning it, every step of the way. And if you've ever been in a place where you had to choose between staying in something familiar or stepping into something unknown but necessary, then you understand how difficult that decision can be. And if you want to follow more stories like this where small moments turn into life-changing realizations, you can subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes the most important journeys don't start with a big moment. They start with a quiet decision to choose yourself.